The jury foreman stood in a federal courtroom in Las Vegas on a Tuesday morning in 1994 and read a number that made grown men stop breathing: $312 million, the largest civil RICO judgment ever handed down against a Las Vegas casino operation. The man who had spent 12 years and $4 million of his own money fighting for that verdict sat at the plaintiff's table and wept. He had done what everyone said was impossible. He had sued Las Vegas and won. But Gerald Roth would never collect a single dollar because 6 months later, he was dead. Hi, my name is Michael, and this is Old Vegas Legends, the show where we dig into the stories Vegas spent a lot of money trying to keep buried. The man nobody talks about. Gerald Roth wasn't famous. That's the first thing you need to understand. He wasn't a mobster or a cowboy. He wasn't a visionary with a volcano out front, or a man who buried silver in the Nevada desert. He was a builder, born in 1938 on the northwest side of Chicago, to a family of Hungarian immigrants who believed in two things: hard work and contracts. His father, Antal Roth, built houses. Not fancy ones, solid ones. The kind that stood through Illinois winters and didn't apologize for it. Gerald inherited that philosophy. He studied civil engineering at the University of Illinois, graduated in 1960, and went to work in commercial real estate development: hotels, office buildings, shopping centers. By the time he was 35, he had a reputation in Chicago as the kind of man you called when you needed a project finished on time and under budget. No drama, just results. He was also, by every account, relentlessly honest. His business partner of 20 years, a man named Louis Cafaro, said this after Gerald died. Jerry believed a handshake meant something. He thought if you signed a document, that document was sacred. That was his whole system. That system worked fine in Chicago. In Las Vegas, it was a death warrant. Gerald Roth wasn't a gambler, which is almost funny when you think about it. He never played cards. He didn't bet on sports. He thought slot machines were a waste of good electricity. But in 1972, a man he trusted handed him a prospectus for a hotel casino development on the Las Vegas Strip. And Gerald Roth did what he always did. He read every page. He ran the numbers. He decided the investment made sense, and he wrote a check. That check would take 22 years to come back to him. And when it finally did, he had 6 months to live. The dream he bought into the project was called the Sovereign, not the most original name in Vegas history. But in 1972, it sounded exactly right. A mid-strip hotel tower, 800 rooms, a casino floor, 2 restaurants, a rooftop lounge. The developer pitching it was a man named Thomas Hardy, a Nevada real estate operator with a clean record and a gift for persuasion. Hardy had assembled a group of Midwestern investors, dentists from Cincinnati, a retired judge from Milwaukee, a grain merchant from Omaha, and Gerald Roth from Chicago, who put in $1.2 million, serious money in 1972, roughly $8 million in today's terms. Hardy sold them the dream the way Vegas always sells dreams: returns of 15 to 20% annually. A growing city, tourists from everywhere. The house always wins, gentlemen. You're not gambling here. You're investing in the house. Gerald Roth signed the papers. The other investors signed the papers. Construction began. And for the first 2 years, everything looked fine. Quarterly reports arrived, numbers that looked healthy. The distributions came through. Gerald reinvested his returns. He told Cafaro the Vegas deal was the smartest thing he'd ever done. He had no idea what was happening in the count room. Here's what nobody told Gerald Roth. What nobody told any of those dentists and judges and grain merchants. Thomas Hardy was not alone. Behind Hardy stood a network of men connected to the Chicago outfit, the Milwaukee family, and a financial structure so deliberately complicated that even experienced FBI agents took years to untangle it. The Sovereign wasn't just a hotel, it was a pipeline. Money flowing in from gamblers on the floor, getting siphoned off before it ever reached the books, ending up in envelopes traveling east by car and by courier to men whose names never appeared on any document. The investors were the front, the clean money that made the whole thing look legitimate, and they were being robbed every single day. How Vegas broke the deal. The skimming at the Sovereign started on day one. That's not an exaggeration. Before the casino floor officially opened, men connected to the outfit had already compromised the coin-weighing machines in the slot department. Before the first dealer sat down, the count room procedures had been quietly restructured to allow cash to be removed before it was officially tallied. I want you to understand what this means in practice. Every dollar a tourist lost at a blackjack table, every quarter swallowed by a slot machine, a percentage of that money was physically removed from the count before it became an official number. The official number went to the books. The books went to the tax authorities. The books went to the investors. And the number in the books was a lie. Gerald Roth was receiving quarterly reports showing moderate, reasonable returns. What he didn't know was that the actual gross revenue of the Sovereign was running roughly 40% higher than what Hardy was reporting. 40%, gone before the ink dried. By 1977, the skim operation at the Sovereign had funneled an estimated $22 million to mob-connected figures across 3 states. By 1979, the total was pushing $40 million. The investors, meanwhile, were receiving distributions based on fabricated numbers and believing everything was fine. Then, in 1980, the FBI came knocking, not at the Sovereign specifically, at a dozen properties across Las Vegas simultaneously. This was the beginning of the federal push that would eventually bring down the Stardust skimming operation and land convictions across 4 mob families. The Sovereign got caught in the net. Federal agents seized internal records, accounting documents, courier logs, the kind of paperwork that doesn't lie. Thomas Hardy disappeared to Arizona and retained 4 lawyers within 48 hours. Classy? Gerald Roth found out what had been happening to his money in a phone call from a federal agent in the spring of 1981. He sat with that information for 3 days before he said a word to anyone. His daughter Patricia remembers those 3 days. She says her father went very quiet. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and just stared at nothing. Then, on the 4th day, Gerald Roth picked up the phone and called an attorney. He had decided to fight. The man who decided to fight now. A lot of people, when they discovered they'd been robbed by men connected to organized crime, would have done exactly what they were supposed to do. Swallowed the loss, moved on. Understood quietly that some debts don't get repaid through a courtroom. Gerald Roth was not a lot of people. Instead, he hired a Chicago civil attorney named Robert Abramson, who had exactly 0 experience in federal racketeering law. But Abramson was smart and stubborn, and he spent 18 months educating himself on the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which had been passed in 1970 and gave civil plaintiffs the ability to sue criminal enterprises directly for damages. The key provision that mattered to Gerald Roth was this: if you could prove a pattern of racketeering activity, any damages awarded to you would be automatically tripled by the court, treble damages. Which means if Gerald could prove he'd been robbed of $100 million, the judgment would be $300 million. The problem was proving it. Proving RICO requires demonstrating a pattern of criminal activity across time, not just one bad actor. You have to connect the dots between individual defendants and show they operated as a coordinated criminal enterprise. The kind of evidence you need is buried in seized federal documents, grand jury testimony, and accounting records that the defendants have spent years making deliberately incomprehensible. Abramson filed the civil complaint in 1982. The defendants, Hardy and a network of 17 named co-conspirators, hired a combined 31 attorneys and immediately launched the most aggressive delay strategy Gerald had ever encountered in a business life full of contract disputes, motions to dismiss, counterfilings, jurisdictional challenges, discovery disputes that ran for years. One co-defendant declared bankruptcy, stalling proceedings for 14 months. Another fled to Costa Rica temporarily, which, I'll be honest with you, is not the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. Gerald Roth spent 11 years in active litigation. He spent $4 million of his own money in legal fees. There were moments, Patricia says there were many moments, when he nearly gave up. when the machine of delay and obstruction and sheer financial exhaustion almost broke him. But Gerald Roth had a thing about contracts, and somebody had broken his. He did not give up. $300 million. The trial began in federal district court in Las Vegas in January of 1994. Gerald Roth was 55 years old. He had been fighting this case for 12 years. He had watched co-defendants die, flee, settle, and vanish. He had survived threats that his attorney later described, carefully, as credible and concerning. He sat in that courtroom every single day. Robert Abramson, who by now had become one of the most experienced civil RICO attorneys in the country, as because one case like this will do that to you, presented 11 days of testimony. Accounting experts, former casino employees granted immunity who testified about the count room procedures, FBI agents from the original investigation, and records, thousands of pages of records showing exactly where the money went and exactly who authorized it to go there. The defense argued that Gerald Roth was a sophisticated investor who assumed risk, that the returns he received were consistent with the original agreements, that whatever criminal activity occurred at the Sovereign was conducted by individuals acting outside their authority, not as part of a coordinated enterprise. The jury didn't buy it. 22 days of deliberation, and on the morning of April the 19th, 1994, the foreperson stood and delivered a verdict that stopped the room cold. Liability established across 14 of the 17 named defendants. Pattern of racketeering activity proven under RICO. Actual damages assessed at $104 million. Trebled under RICO statute, $312 million. Gerald Roth gripped the arms of his chair and didn't move for a long moment. Then he put his face in his hands. Patricia was in the gallery. She said later she had never seen her father cry. Not at his wife's funeral. Not at anything. He cried that morning. And I want you to really sit with this. $312 million in civil damages was, at that time, one of the largest civil RICO verdicts in American legal history. This wasn't just a personal victory. This was a legal earthquake, a signal that organized crime could be held accountable in ways criminal prosecution sometimes couldn't reach. Gerald Roth had done something almost nobody believed was possible. He had sued Las Vegas, and he had won. The cruelest hand Vegas ever dealt. Here's where the story stops being about money. 3 weeks after the verdict, Gerald Roth's doctor told him the back pain he'd been managing for 8 months wasn't a herniated disc. It was pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already spread. Pancreatic cancer at stage 4 in 1994 was not a diagnosis. It was a sentence. Median survival time, 3 to 6 months. Gerald Roth had lived long enough to hear the verdict. He would not live long enough to collect. Now, I've covered a lot of dark stories on this channel. The Binions tearing each other apart. Gus Greenbaum murdered in his own bed. Ted Binion dying on a yoga mat with heroin in his stomach. But this one gets me differently, because Gerald Roth didn't die at the hands of organized crime. He didn't get a bomb under his Cadillac. He just ran out of time. The cruelest, most ordinary way to lose. Robert Abramson said the timing was the hardest thing he'd experienced in a 30-year legal career. We had done the impossible. 12 years. And he found out 3 weeks later. Gerald Roth spent his final months at home in Chicago. He gave no interviews. He made no public statements. His daughter Patricia says he wasn't bitter, which, if you ask me, would have been completely understandable. She says he was mostly quiet. He sat on the back porch and watched the yard. He had the temperament of a man who had settled something important and was at peace with it. On the 14th of November, 1994, 7 months after the verdict, Gerald Roth died at home, surrounded by his family. He was 56 years old. The $312 million judgment sat in the federal courts. Untouched, the defendants, within days of his death, filed for an emergency stay of the judgment pending appeal. Vegas had found its angle. It always does. What happened to the money? The appeals began before Gerald was buried. 14 defendants, 31 attorneys, and a legal system that rewards delay as a survival strategy. Over the next 4 years, the judgment wound through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, partially upheld, partially reduced, carved into pieces across proceedings that Gerald's estate and his co-investors had to fight simultaneously. Some of those co-investors, those dentists and judges and grain merchants who had signed the same papers Gerald signed in 1972, had been fighting alongside him for 12 years. Some had died waiting. Some had gone broke in legal fees. Some had settled for pennies on the dollar just to end the bleeding. By the early 2000s, the actual dollars collected across all plaintiffs had been ground down through appeals, through defendant bankruptcies, through legal fees consuming recoveries, to somewhere between $18 and $25 million, shared among Gerald's estate, the surviving co-investors, and their attorneys. Not nothing. But not $312 million. Several original defendants never paid a dollar. They died judgment-proof, or had structured their assets in ways that made collection legally impossible. The men who had spent 40 years learning to hide money from the federal government had a considerable head start on anyone trying to find it. Robert Abramson continued practicing law. He became a leading civil RICO attorney, partly famous and partly haunted by the Roth case. He gave a lecture on it once at Northwestern Law School and said simply, "We won everything except the thing that mattered most, enough time." So, what do you do with a story like that? Gerald Roth believed in contracts, in the idea that the law, if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and willing to spend 12 years and $4 million, would eventually protect you. And in a technical sense, he was right. The jury agreed with him. The federal court agreed with him. $312 million said he was right. But Vegas has always operated on a different timeline. A timeline where the house doesn't just win the game, it outlasts the player. Gerald Roth outlasted the mob's control of that casino. He outlasted 11 years of legal obstruction. He outlasted every attorney and co-defendant who tried to wear him down. He just didn't outlast his own body. And that, I think, is the cruelest bet Las Vegas ever made. Not against a gambler, against a man who didn't even believe in gambling. A builder from Chicago who trusted a handshake and spent the rest of his life trying to make that handshake mean something. The house won anyway. I'm Michael, and this is Old Vegas Legends. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, tell me in the comments, which part hit you hardest? And if you want more of the real stories behind the neon, the ones Vegas never put on a billboard, hit subscribe, because every legend has a story, and Vegas never forgets.